Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Rafe Mair, former BC Cabinet Minister and Canada's longest-running #1 radio talk show host. Welcome to the show, Rafe.
Always a pleasure, Jim.
Well, if they were keeping score at the Supreme Court of Canada right now, I think the score is 9-1 against Stephen Harper. The latest ruling saying that you can have non-smokable marijuana used as a medicinal element in your medicine or what you need to take for whatever ailment you have. And we have his health minister, Ambrose, saying she will fight this tooth and nail. Well, how do you fight the Supreme Court of Canada?
Well, what troubles me here, Jim, is I sense an abuse of the system here. The Supreme Court of Canada, now, it's set up technically to do the kind of things that Harper is doing, but really, morally, it's set up to handle very serious constitutional questions, mostly between provinces and the federal government, interpreting the law and so on. And it's meant for serious cases. It's meant for things that really matter in the long term. He is now trying to make this the arbiter of his own version of social policy. And I think he's being surprised because Supreme Courts are customarily quite conservative, and this court has been appointed mostly by conservatives, but they're not turning out that way. And it sort of reminds me of the old Warren Court in President Eisenhower's time. You may remember that Warren scared the hell out of Eisenhower when he found in favor of or against segregation. Eisenhower never thought that would happen. So these are the kind of things that are happening now. I think the Supreme Court of Canada, without saying so, is giving a message to Mr. Harper. Look, you come to us when you've got a serious question of jurisdiction between the provinces or whatever it may be, but keep this social stuff out, and when the Court of Appeal rules, accept the ruling of the Court of Appeal. They can't legally do that, but I think that's the message you're trying to give.
Well, it struck down the prostitution law, saying they were unconstitutional. The marijuana law was unconstitutional. Everything, it seems to be, the rulings go unconstitutional. The ruling in favor of Aboriginal land claims, saying that the government's policy was unconstitutional. It seems that the Prime Minister has very little respect for the Canadian Constitution.
Well, I think that's true. Some of those cases, the Aboriginal cases, have really been a string of Supreme Court cases going back into Trudeau's time, and I consider that to be a legitimate use of the Supreme Court, and I think that they have told us essentially what the law is over a period of perhaps 25 or 30 years and got the Canadian public to understand just what it's all about. But these other ones, things like prostitution and marijuana and so on, I find those to be a waste of time, and I think an insult to the intelligence of Canadians. I really don't think you need the Supreme Court of Canada to rule on those things every time you happen to lose in the Court of Appeal, which the government does regularly.
Is this a case of the federal government using its deep pockets to go after people who question their policies?
Oh, of course it is. They've got the ability to do that. And, the courts they're cognizant of that, I think. And, as I say, I don't know. I'm reading between the lines, Jim. And as you know, I've been away from the practice of law now for 40 years. So I don't keep on top of things like I once did. But I just sense that the Supreme Court of Canada is saying, look, you go to the Court of Appeal, that's where these things ought to be settled. If it's a very serious constitutional issue, bring it here. Otherwise, bugger off.
Well, I mean, even Harper had one of his appointments to the Supreme Court of Canada rejected because they said the process used was unconstitutional as well. I think that judge had very little experience. Well,
if fixing Supreme Courts is not a novel Canadian idea. The Roosevelt got into trouble with that when in his time, and from time to time, American presidents, hard as this is to believe, Jim, but they try to stack the Supreme Court with people who are going to favor their policies. And I have no doubt that Harper is quite prepared to do that if he can get away with it. And I'm very serious about this issue because, as you know, I went through constitutional stuff for the provincial government many, many years ago, and when we were patriating the Constitution, the actual Constitution of the Supreme Court of Canada was a very important consideration, and how you appoint them. And I'm not satisfied with the way it's done now. I think there has to be a much better public vetting of the candidates than there is now, and not just a law society here and that sort of stuff, because it's a hugely important job. Now, we have been very lucky in Canada. We've had very good justices, and we now have a very good Chief Justice, in my view. But, it doesn't mean it's going to happen always. If the political people can get involved and put people on the bench that are going to favor them. Now, second thing, before I let that go, as I said with the Warren case, the judges often surprise the hell out of you because they go on there as being very partisan in their minds. They get on there, realize what that robe means, realize what their obligation is, and all of a sudden don't do quite what the Prime Minister was hoping they're going to do. So we've always got that to save us. But that's pretty thin gruel. I think we should have a better way of appointing Supreme Court justices so we know what we're getting before we get them.
Perhaps have the senior justices elect a new appointee.
Well, that's one consideration. There are a number of them that come to mind. We seem to have this fear of having a hearing, and I can remember having this argument many times in Ottawa during the constitutional stuff, and people, particularly lawyers, would say, "Oh, you can't put a judge through the business of having hearings and having to answer questions." My answer was, he's not a judge yet. If he were a judge, I guess you could see he's got some dignity to stand on. But he's a man that wants a job on the bench. And he, like anybody else, I think, ought to be open to questions and so on as to his qualifications for doing that. Now, obviously, you can go too far, but Canadians are not known for going too far and things like that. I think it would be a civilized process. But it strikes me as odd that we in Canada permit somebody to take on a job that is so powerful. I mean, it's one of the most powerful jobs in the country, if not the most powerful in the end. We allow that to happen without any idea who that person is before all of a sudden he or she is appointed. And that strikes me as being not only odd, but very dangerous.
We'll have more with Rafe Mair right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
In Goddard we trust.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Rafe Mair. Well, maybe an issue that you might be able to wade in with some knowledge is possible Senate reform. The latest Auditor General report finding at least another 9 senators have abused their expense system. And people are saying, well, you can't change things in the Senate unless you get unanimous approval from the provinces.
But I want to say something a little different about this, Jim. I mean, I've been reading a lot, Jeffrey Simpson in the Globe and Mail and so on, about people talking about this. And incidentally, Jeffrey Simpson wrote a hell of a good article earlier in the week on this. But a lot of them, like Thomas Mulcair, are saying just abolish the Senate, this, that, and the other thing. We have, if you think about it, a glorious opportunity to revisit the whole notion of an upper house. There is nothing wrong with that notion. As a matter of fact, in a country as big as Canada, with a population spread out like it is, there's an awful lot right with an upper house. Countries like Australia, the United States, and so on have them because if you don't, you find that there is a dictatorship of the majority in a small part of the country, which runs the whole country, and you have to give some regional input. And the trick is to find out how. Now, A, you can't tinker with this one. I mean, it's beyond tinkering. So, B, you have to make up your mind, do you want to have an upper house or don't you? I think the argument is very strong that yes, you do. Then number 3 is take your time. Put together a committee of some sort of people all across Canada, like we did in BC for parliamentary reform. Put them together and say, this is the problem. Come back from time to time and let us know how you're getting along. We'll give you all the expertise that you ask for. But if you don't think it's a good idea, tell us immediately. If you do, give us your best suggestion and let's take a look at it as a public. If we like it, we'll accept it. If we don't, we won't. But I think it's worth going to all that trouble for because in a country our size, it's dangerous not to have regional input at the center. And this country is not as strong and as united as a lot of people in Toronto think it is. And there are a lot of people right across the country that are getting very tired of this Toronto centricity we have in the country and the domination of the country by a few people. And that's getting worse and worse and worse. So I think the time has come to say, look, we didn't do this right in the first place. We let a number of old farts put together a Senate that suited their interests. They even appointed the Senate so that the House of Commons would still rule everything. let's get rid of all that. Let's start right from the beginning. Change its name, whatever it may be, but get down and have a proper House representing the regions. And I think this is a perfect time to do that.
Like the U.S. system where every state gets 2 senators, so little Rhode Island is just as powerful technically as New York or California.
Well, you run that trouble. The good thing about the United States is there being 50 states, that sort of balances itself out. In Canada, it's ludicrous to think of Prince Edward Island having the same power as Ontario or Quebec. Everybody knows that. So we're going to have to find a Canadian system. And how we do that, I don't know. That would be to presume what a committee should think about. But there are those difficulties. And when we were involved in the 70s with the patriation of the Constitution, BC was very strong in having a new type of Senate. But there wasn't any great will to do anything in Canada, mainly because nobody knew what the hell they wanted to do. Ontario and Quebec were quite satisfied. After all, they ran the place anyway, so they were okay. In those days, thank God it's changed. Atlantic Canada was pretty well client states of Ontario for money, so they went along. The prairies were largely indifferent until you got to Alberta, and the only thing that Lougheed wanted to make sure is that Alberta had as many seats in the Senate as BC did. So, it sort of degenerated. So that's why I said we have to start all over again with a clean slate, clean minds, and work on the issue, or just say the hell with it and don't do it and take our chances.
Do you think Canadians are tired of this issue? I mean, I know the reason Mulcair says abolish it is because we've had this long-running system where we're seeing senator after senator accused of wrongdoing when it comes to handling money, and they're saying, well, if they can't handle their own expenses, how can they handle the affairs of the nation?
Oh, I think you're right that the Canadian public right now would simply say a pox on all of them. I don't want to hear about it anymore. Just get rid of it and let's forget it. I guess what I'm saying is, as a person who's been around for quite a long time now and has been involved in constitutional affairs for a long time, don't be so hasty. The idea is not a bad one. It's the way the idea works that's not good. Now, another thing I've got to say, Jim, Canadians particularly are wont to make perfection the enemy of improvement. If we don't get something perfect, we don't want it. We're never going to get something perfect, but we can certainly get something an awful lot better that would suit our Canadian purposes. My opinion is we should look for that. At this particular time, I agree with you. The mood is no, we don't even want to think about it anymore. I just think that that's hasty, and we should give that another thought.
Do you have any models in mind, or do you think it's a case of you need more people to put more ideas in?
Oh, I think there are lots of models. Australia is probably the best one I can think of. The United States is a good model, but as I say, they're lucky that their little states have been balanced off by middle-sized states and big ones and so on. So far there hasn't been a ridiculous thing where Rhode Island can hold up the entire country. But you have to worry about those sorts of things. But I think you have to have a made-in-Canada solution. I think it has to be elected, but again, I'm presupposing that that's what people would want. I think it's got to be elected. I think it's got to have its powers clearly delineated so that there is a breaking power in the Senate with the House of Commons, but not the power to stop it completely. In other words, what you want to do is to force the House of Commons to think about regional issues before they pass their laws. And I think Australia works very well. Now, you only hear about these things when they're not working, of course. That's when it gets world headlines, when a governor general is thrust out or something happens, and or prime minister does, as has happened in Australia. But day in, day out, I think if you asked Australians, they'd say, no, we don't want that Senate abolished. No, it does a pretty good job day by day. It looks after Western Australia just like it looks after New South Wales. And I think that would be one of the models I would look at most closely. I'd also look at the German model. I haven't looked at that now for about 30 years, but it was something to be, there was a lot to admire in it when I was studying it years ago.
Well, how does the Australian system work for the Senate?
Well, I was afraid you asked that question.
Crikey, mate.
Oh, yeah. That's right. I believe it has equal representation for the various states. And it has its powers delineated. I'm not sure exactly how it works. I did once, Jim, but I'm getting kind of old now. You can't expect me to remember all those things.
Well, they do things upside down there.
That's right. Of course they do. Of course they do. But, I guess my point is you can look at other examples, and so you should, and you'll find some that look better than others, but you should look at all of them, but you have to come up with a made-in-Canada solution. That's the only way it'll work.
And, of course, we can't ask the Prime Minister what he thinks of any ideas about the Senate because he doesn't answer questions from reporters anymore.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't, and he would be the last one to want one. You've got to remember that every politician thinks that the system by which they got elected is perfect. And, they don't care that it doesn't work as long as they get elected by it. And that's why we have to stand back, and why the idea in British Columbia of the constitutional constituent assembly we had a few years ago, while it didn't perhaps work the way everybody would like, it worked in the sense that people absorbed the knowledge, absorbed the information, and came up with intelligent recommendations. The fact that they were or weren't passed is neither here nor there. That was the way to go, and I think, if nothing else, Jim, they got people thinking. They got people to understand what the problem was. They may not have the right solution, but they began to see, look, there's the things here we got to worry about. And you see it in the legislature, in the parliament. The backbenchers have no power, et cetera, et cetera. People understand that, where I don't think before we had that constituent assembly, people thought about that very much.
Well, I think you're the one who told me the Senate is supposed to be the house of sober second thought, but looking at some of these expense bills, I don't know how sober they were.
No, I don't know. I certainly didn't invent that term. And the present Senate is a disgrace. There's just no question about that. And I'm horrified, to think of people like Nancy Green-Rain, who I've admired so much over the years, claiming that when she had expenses to go to St. Germain's departure party, that was a legitimate public expense. You get yourself into a mindset that's unreal, because everybody else is doing it, and it's too late. We have to get something new, no question about that. New people, new rules, new pitcher, new strikes.
Rafe, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
My pleasure, Jim, always.
My guest has been Rafe Mair, former BC Cabinet Minister and Canada's longest-running #1 radio talk show host. You're listening to The Goddard Report on TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Check out our popular YouTube channel, Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on The Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.